The cold metal of a kitchen knife pressed against my throat is a sensation I will never forget, especially because it happened while the rest of the world was cheering for a fresh start. I could hear the muffled sounds of the neighbors through the thick walls, their laughter and the clinking of glasses echoing like a cruel joke while I sat paralyzed in my own living room. It was exactly 11:55 p.m., 5 minutes before the ball dropped, and I was staring into the cold, empty eyes of a man who didn't want my money or my car. He wanted me to sit perfectly still while he finished his work in my basement. The evening had started out so normally, almost boringly so, as I decided to skip the loud parties for a quiet night in my new apartment. I had moved into this building only 3 weeks ago, lured by the high ceilings and the cheap rent that should have been my first warning sign. The building was an old converted textile mill on the edge of the industrial district, where the streets get very quiet once the sun goes down. I remember looking out the window at 8 p.m., watching the light snow dust the empty parking lot and feeling a sense of peace. I had my favorite meal cooling on the counter and a movie queued up, ready to drift into the new year without any drama. As the hours ticked by, the wind began to howl against the large, drafty windows, creating a low whistling sound that I tried to ignore. Around 10 p.m., I heard the first strange noise coming from the floorboards below my feet. It sounded like someone was dragging a heavy trunk across the concrete floor of the basement unit directly beneath mine. I knew that unit was supposed to be vacant, as the landlord had mentioned it was being treated for mold and was strictly off-limits to tenants. I told myself it was just the old pipes or perhaps the wind rattling the industrial vents. Why would anyone be working in a moldy basement on New Year's Eve? The curiosity started to itch at the back of my brain, a persistent little doubt that wouldn't let me focus on my movie. I found myself turning the volume down, sitting in total silence, just listening to the rhythmic thud-thud-thud from below. It was too consistent to be the wind and too heavy to be a stray animal. I stood up and walked to my hallway, where the door to the basement stairs was located. I noticed a thin sliver of light peeking through the gap at the bottom of the wooden door. My heart gave a small, uncomfortable thump against my ribs. The landlord lived across town, and I was the only tenant currently residing on this side of the building. I should have called the police right then, but I didn't want to be the person who called 911 because of a few bumps in the night on a holiday. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, and turned the cold brass knob of the basement door. It was unlocked, which was strange because I had seen the landlord padlocking it just 2 days prior. I opened it just an inch, and the smell that hit me was not mold, but something sharp and chemical like industrial bleach mixed with something metallic. Below me, I could hear a muffled conversation, 2 voices speaking in low, hurried whispers about getting the plastic down before the fireworks started. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty hallway as I realized these people weren't supposed to be there. I backed away slowly, trying to make no sound on the hardwood floors, but my heel caught on the edge of a loose rug. The floorboard let out a loud, piercing creak that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. The whispering below stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, lasting for what felt like an eternity as I stood frozen in the dark. Then, I heard the sound of heavy boots hitting the wooden stairs, coming up toward me with terrifying speed. I ran for my front door, my hands fumbling with the deadbolt, but I was too late. The basement door burst open and a large man in a dark utility jacket lunged at me, his face obscured by a simple surgical mask. He tackled me to the floor, the air rushing out of my lungs in a painful gasp. Before I could scream, he had his hand over my mouth and that terrifyingly cold blade held against the side of my neck. He told me to be quiet, his voice a low, jagged rasp that sounded like he hadn't spoken in days. He dragged me toward my sofa and forced me to sit, never taking the knife away from my skin. "Just 5 minutes," he whispered, glancing at the digital clock on my oven. "We just need the noise of the fireworks. If you make a sound before then, I'll have to add you to the basement floor." My blood turned to ice as I realized what he was implying. They weren't burglars. They were cleaning up a crime, and they were using the loud celebrations of New Year's Eve to mask whatever gruesome work they were doing. I looked at the clock, 11:57. 3 minutes of life left if I didn't figure out a way to escape this man's grip. I noticed that while he was focused on me, he was also glancing nervously toward the basement door, clearly worried about his partner seeing something or perhaps getting impatient. I felt his grip on my shoulder loosen just a fraction as a loud car horn honked outside, startling him. This was my only window of opportunity. I knew I couldn't outrun him in a straight line, but I knew this apartment better than he did. On the coffee table next to me was a heavy glass ashtray that the previous tenant had left behind. As the first few distant pops of early fireworks began to crackle in the sky, I reached out and slammed the ashtray into his shin with every bit of strength I had. He roared in pain, his balance shifting just enough for me to roll off the sofa and scramble toward the kitchen. He lunged again, but his boots slipped on the rug I had tripped on earlier. I didn't head for the front door this time, knowing he would catch me before I could unlock it. Instead, I dived into the small pantry and slammed the heavy oak door, sliding the interior bolt just as his weight crashed against the other side. The pantry was tiny, smelling of stale flour and spices, and I could hear him screaming threats through the wood, kicking at the panels until they began to splinter. I reached into my pocket and realized with a surge of hope that I still had my phone. My fingers flew across the screen, dialing the emergency number while the man outside started using a heavy tool to break through the door. "Please," I whispered to the operator. "I'm at 402 Mill Street. Someone is trying to kill me." Outside, the world erupted into a cacophony of sound. Thousands of fireworks exploded at once, filling the night with booms and whistles that drowned out the sound of the man breaking into my pantry. I huddled on the floor, watching the wood splinter and crack as a crowbar forced its way through the frame. But then, above the sound of the celebrations, I heard something else. The high-pitched, beautiful wail of a siren turning into the parking lot. The kicking stopped. I heard a panicked shout from the basement, then the sound of the front door being thrown open and heavy footsteps sprinting away. I stayed in that pantry for a long time, even after the police pounded on my door and identified themselves. It wasn't until I saw the blue and red lights reflecting off my kitchen tiles that I finally felt the strength to unbolt the door. The police found the basement empty, but they found the evidence of what had been happening down there. A scene that confirmed I would have never seen the morning of January 1st if I hadn't fought back. I spent the first day of the year in a police station, but as the sun rose over the city, I had never been more grateful to be alive. I was staring at the condensation on my wine glass when I realized the kitchen staff hadn't just stopped cooking. They had stopped existing. It was 11:15 p.m. on New Year's Eve, and I was sitting at the most exclusive table in the city, a place called the Iron Vault, which was literally an old bank basement converted into a 5-star restaurant. The walls were 3 feet of solid stone, and the only way in or out was a massive steel door that looked like it belonged on a battleship. My date had gone to the restroom 10 minutes ago, and as I looked around the dining room, a cold prickle of unease crawled up my spine because the usual bustle of waiters had been replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the marble floor, and walked toward the swinging double doors of the kitchen to check on a waiter. When I pushed them open, I didn't see chefs prepping the midnight appetizers or pans searing over blue flames. I saw a row of industrial crates stacked by the walk-in freezer and a group of 5 men in gray tactical jumpsuits silently zip-tying the actual kitchen staff, who were huddled on the floor with duct tape over their mouths. One of the men looked up, his eyes cold and clinical, and he didn't reach for a notepad. He reached for a heavy, black crowbar and began to walk toward me with a terrifyingly slow, deliberate pace. I backed out of the kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack them. I looked back at the dining room and realized the nightmare was already unfolding there too. 3 other men had entered from the main vault door, and they weren't asking for wallets or jewelry. They were systematically locking the heavy bolts of the vault from the inside. We weren't being robbed in the traditional sense. We were being sealed in. I ducked behind a velvet curtain near the coat check, my breath coming in jagged, shallow gasps as I watched them round up the other 30 guests. The leader of the group stood on a table, his voice sounding hollow and metallic in the stone chamber. He told us that they were former employees of the investment firm that was hosting this private party, men who had lost everything in a legal settlement earlier that year. He called this their final severance package, and he explained that the vault was on a timed lock that wouldn't open until 8 a.m. on New Year's Day. My mind raced as I realized what that meant. We were trapped in a soundproof box beneath the city streets, and they had nearly 9 hours to do whatever they planned to do to the executives sitting in that room. I felt a hand grab my ankle from behind the curtain, and I nearly screamed before a familiar voice whispered my name. It was my date, Sarah, who had been hiding in the small corridor leading to the wine cellar. Her face was ghostly white, and she pointed toward a small service elevator used for bringing up crates of champagne. It was barely 3 feet wide and operated on a manual pulley system, a relic from the building's days as a bank. It was our only hope of reaching the street level, but it was located directly behind the bar where one of the men was currently standing guard. We crawled through the shadows of the peripheral tables, moving only when the leader raised his voice to shout at the trembling guests. Every time a glass broke or a chair moved, I felt my stomach drop, expecting a heavy hand to grab my collar. We reached the bar, the smell of spilled gin and expensive perfume thick in the air. The guard was looking the other direction, distracted by his partner who was beginning to pry open the industrial crates we had seen in the kitchen. I peeked over the mahogany edge and saw what was inside. They weren't weapons, but hundreds of canisters of industrial-grade cleaning chemicals and large rolls of plastic sheeting. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They weren't planning on leaving with the guests. They were planning on making sure no one ever walked out of that vault again. I nudged Sarah and pointed toward the service lift. We squeezed into the tiny, cramped space, the smell of grease and old metal surrounding us. I grabbed the heavy hemp rope and began to pull, my muscles screaming with the effort of trying to move the lift silently. Every inch felt like a mile, and the rope groaned with a low, rhythmic sound that seemed loud enough to wake the dead. Suddenly, the lift jerked to a halt. I looked down through the floor slats and saw the hand of the guard gripping the bottom of the carriage. He had heard us. He started pulling the lift back down, his strength far greater than mine. I looked around the tiny box and saw a heavy glass bottle of champagne sitting in the corner, likely forgotten by a waiter earlier in the shift. I grabbed it by the neck and, as the guard's face appeared in the gap below us, I dropped it with everything I had. The bottle shattered against his shoulder, the explosion of glass and pressurized liquid startling him just long enough for him to let go. I pulled the rope with a desperate, frantic energy, my palms burning and bleeding as the lift rose toward the ceiling. We reached the service hatch just as we heard the men shouting below. I pushed the hatch open and we scrambled out into a narrow alleyway behind the restaurant, the freezing December air hitting my face like a blessing. We didn't stop running until we found a police cruiser parked 3 blocks away near the city's main countdown stage. As the fireworks began to explode over the skyline, marking the start of a new year, I sat on the bumper of the police car with a shock blanket wrapped around my shoulders. I watched as a SWAT team swarmed the entrance of the building, the bright flashes of the celebrations reflecting off their helmets. I realized then that while thousands of people were cheering for the future, I was just grateful to have escaped the tomb that was supposed to be a celebration. I still can't go into small rooms or basement restaurants without looking for the exit, and I never did find out exactly what those men planned to do with all that plastic. But I know that New Year's Eve was the last time I ever took my safety for granted. The wind was screaming through the pine trees outside my remote mountain cabin, but the sound that truly chilled my blood was the soft, rhythmic tapping on the glass of my kitchen door. It was 11 p.m. on New Year's Eve, and a massive blizzard had cut off the only road leading down to the valley, leaving me completely isolated in a world of white and gray. I had been sitting by the fireplace with a book when the tapping started, and when I looked up, I saw a man standing in the swirling snow, his face pale and his eyes wide with a desperate, frantic energy. He was shivering violently, wearing only a thin denim jacket that was soaked through with melting ice. I hesitated for a long time, my heart thumping against my ribs, because common sense told me that nobody should be out in this weather on foot. But as I watched him collapse onto his knees in the snow, I felt a surge of pity that overruled my instincts. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pulled him inside, the freezing wind rushing into my warm living room like a predator. He huddled on the floor near the hearth, his teeth chattering so loudly it sounded like pebbles shaking in a jar. He told me his name was Marcus and that his car had slid off the embankment 3 miles up the road. I brought him a thick wool blanket and a cup of hot tea, watching him closely as he began to thaw out. There was something off about the way he wouldn't look me in the eye, and his hands, though shaking, didn't look like the hands of a stranded traveler. They were covered in small, jagged scars, and his knuckles were bruised a deep, angry purple. As he drank, he started asking questions that felt a little too specific. He wanted to know if I had a landline, if the cell service was always this dead during storms, and if anyone else was expected to arrive for the midnight countdown. I lied and told him my brother was driving up with a snowmobile, but I could tell he didn't believe me. While he was warming up, I went into the mudroom to get him some dry clothes, and that is when I saw it. His wet denim jacket had fallen off the chair, and a heavy, leather-bound notebook had slid out of the pocket. I picked it up to put it back, but the book fell open to a page that made the air vanish from my lungs. It was a hand-drawn floor plan of my cabin. Not just a rough sketch, but a detailed map with my bedroom, the basement entrance, and the location of my outdoor generator all circled in red ink. Underneath the drawing was a list of times, including 11:50 p.m. power cut. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized Marcus hadn't crashed his car at all. He had been watching me, waiting for the perfect moment when the storm would mask his arrival and the New Year's celebrations would explain away any noise. I looked at the kitchen clock, 11:45. I had 5 minutes before he expected the lights to go out, and I was currently standing in a small room with no exit while a predator sat in my living room. I knew I couldn't run out into the blizzard without a coat or boots, as the cold would kill me in minutes. I heard the floorboards creak behind me and I shoved the notebook under a pile of laundry just as Marcus appeared in the doorway. The shivering was gone now, and his posture was straight and menacing. He asked me what was taking so long, his voice now steady and devoid of the victim act he had been playing earlier. I forced a smile and told him I was just looking for a pair of warm socks. I managed to slip a heavy iron doorstop into the pocket of my cardigan as I walked past him, my skin crawling at how close he stood to me in the narrow hallway. We sat back down by the fire, the silence between us now thick and suffocating. I watched the digital clock on the mantel, 11:49, 11:50. Suddenly, the lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged the cabin into total pitch-black darkness. The only light came from the dying embers of the fire, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. I didn't wait for him to move. I knew he expected me to be confused and scared, but I was already moving toward the heavy oak dining table. I heard him stand up, the sound of a folding knife clicking open echoing in the dark. "The generator must have failed," he said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying growl. "I should go check on it for you." I didn't answer. I crawled under the table, holding my breath so tightly my chest ached. I heard his heavy boots thudding across the floor toward where I had been sitting, and when he found the chair empty, he let out a frustrated snarl. He began kicking at the furniture, his footsteps coming closer and closer to my hiding spot. I knew I had to get to the basement, as it was the only room with a heavy steel door that locked from the inside. As he moved toward the kitchen, I scrambled out from under the table and bolted for the basement stairs. I heard him roar in anger as he realized where I was going. I reached the door and practically fell down the wooden steps, fumbling for the bolt in the dark. I slammed it shut and slid the metal bar into place just as his weight crashed against the wood with the force of a battering ram. I sat on the cold concrete floor, my heart racing as he screamed threats from the other side, promising that he would wait until the storm broke to finish what he started. But he had made one fatal mistake in his planning. The generator controls were inside the basement with me. I reached up and flipped the emergency bypass switch, and suddenly, The entire cabin's exterior floodlights roared to life, illuminating the snow-covered yard like a stadium. The sudden glare must have spooked him, or perhaps he realized that the lights would be visible for miles to the highway patrol teams clearing the main road. I heard him scramble away from the door and out through the kitchen. I stayed in that basement for 3 hours, watching the security camera feed on my phone until I saw the flashing blue lights of a search and rescue team appearing in the driveway. They had seen my emergency lights from the ridge. Marcus was gone, leaving nothing but his wet jacket and that terrifying notebook behind. I spent the first morning of the year moving into a hotel in the city, knowing that the stranded stranger was still out there somewhere in the white silence.